Framed by a doorway that had surrendered to the seasons stood two small girls, no older than 7. They were barefoot in the snow, their thin nightgowns offering no defense against the biting air, making them appear as twin apparitions against the dark wood. One girl's hand was a knot on her sister's sleeve. They did not weep, they did not knock. They simply stood, and for a long moment Elias did the same. He was not a man prone to impulse. The rhythms of the ranch had ground that out of him. A fence line was to be walked, each post tested for rot. Livestock learned to trust stillness, not sudden movements. And people, he had long ago concluded, were blind to anything that did not shout for their attention. But these children made no sound. They presented no plea. That was the most harrowing part. They had already been taught that asking was a useless endeavor. A gust of wind descended from the hills, rustling the fabric of Elias's coat and lifting the hems of the girls' gowns in a spectral dance. The smaller of the two began to tremble violently, her knees knocking together. The other shifted, a fractional movement, a meager offering of her own scant warmth. It was not nearly enough. Elias blinked, dropping his gaze as if from a light too bright, and urged his horse onward. That ought to have been the conclusion of the matter, but the image lingered. It was a burr under a saddle blanket, digging deeper with every passing hour. He performed his evening chores by the unsteady glow of a lantern, the storm that had been threatening all day finally beginning to gather its strength overhead. In the swaying dance of shadows, he saw two figures whose stillness was too profound to be a trick of the light. Later, lying in his bed listening to the timber of his roof groaning under the weight of the wind, his mind became a tormentor, playing out grim possibilities. What if one had stumbled in the dark? What if she had lacked the strength to rise again? By dawn, a fresh layer of snow had settled upon the roof, a soft, white absolution, and the memory of the girls had seemingly been buried with it. But it hadn't. At the general store, the talk was of the sudden cold snap and a cow that had delivered stillborn twins up on Miller's Ridge. They spoke of the preacher, Silas Blackwood, a man who, it was rumored, had once spoken in heavenly tongues before his wife had been called home by the Lord. No one mentioned the girls, at least not in a direct manner. But one woman, a formidable presence with work-stiffened hands and a gaze that missed nothing, leaned toward him over a barrel of flour. "They say he raises 'em in piety," she murmured, her voice a dry rustle. "The Lord's work is rarely a gentle thing." Elias offered no reply. He purchased his flour, 2 pairs of children's wool socks, and a tin of molasses. That night, as the sky deepened to the color of a fresh bruise and the wind honed itself against the flatlands, he found himself riding past the cabin once more. He told himself it was merely to satisfy a nagging curiosity. They were there again, looking even more fragile than he remembered. One was turned toward the cabin wall, as if in punishment, while the other stared up at the indifferent stars, perhaps hoping for a witness. This time Elias did not pause. He rode on, his hands clenched on the reins, a nut tightening in his gut like something left too long in the unforgiving cold. The following day he returned to town with a load of split rails and a crate of eggs for trade. He saw Dr. Miller near the hitching post and asked, with a casualness he did not feel, "The Blackwood girls, do you know their names?" The doctor shot him a sidelong glance. "Cora and Iris, I believe. Twins. Never a spot of bother from them." Elias nodded his thanks and continued on his way. Bother, he mused later, came in many forms. Some kinds were loud and demanding, Others simply stood in the snow waiting for someone to finally declare that enough was enough. By the third night, pretense was a luxury he could no longer afford. The wind had become a malevolent force, and the snow fell not down, but sideways, as if the sky itself had grown weary and collapsed. The single lantern in the cabin window was dark. No sound emerged from within. Yet the girls stood in their usual place, their posture unchanged, their faces pale and still as sculpted marble. This time he dismounted. His boots sank into the deep snow as he approached, his movements slow and deliberate, as if they were fawns that might bolt at any sudden gesture. He did not speak at first, simply crouching a few yards away. The one with the sharper gaze, Iris, he presumed, watched him with the wary intelligence of a fox studying a trap. The other, Cora, blinked snowflakes from her lashes, her gaze remaining fixed on the ground. "Are you cold?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. There was no response. He reached inside his coat and produced a handkerchief bundled around something. "A biscuit," he offered. "Still warm. I made an extra." Cora's eyes flickered to her sister. Iris remained motionless. After a long moment, Elias placed the small bundle on the step between them and stood up. He did not linger to see if they would take it. The next day he built up the fire in his hearth, not for his own comfort, but to dry a pair of small woolen mittens he had discovered in a chest of drawers. They were a child's size, a relic from a life that never had the chance to be lived. He folded them with care and placed them in a canvas satchel along with some dried beef, a handful of dried apples, and the socks he had purchased. That night, the girls were not on the porch. The space was empty, the snow a pristine, unbroken sheet. The door was shut fast, no light, no sound, no plume of smoke from the chimney. He hesitated, then walked onto the stoop and set the satchel down. Before he could retreat, the door creaked open a few inches. A tall, rigid shadow filled the gap. "What business do you have here, Thorn?" The man's voice was as dry and brittle as dead leaves. "Dropping off some extra food and mittens. Had 'em spare." "They have no need of charity," Silas Blackwood stated, stepping out fully into the biting wind, his breath forming a cloud between them. "They have need of discipline." Elias said nothing, his gaze trying to penetrate the darkness of the cabin behind the man. "Are they yours?" Elias asked, his tone quiet. Silas's jaw clenched. "They are mine by blood, by the word of God, and by any law that holds sway in this world. They will learn obedience or they will learn the cold." "That's one method of teaching." Silas snatched the satchel from the step and flung it into a snowdrift. "They will not accept handouts. If you wish to offer salvation, save it for yourself." The door met its frame with a crack of finality that echoed louder than any sermon. The silence that followed was immense and suffocating. Elias remained for a long time. By the time he rode back to his ranch, the wind had quieted, and the snow was blanketing the world in a soft, inexorable layer. He sat on the floor before his cold hearth, staring at the empty space, and wondered how many nights a child had to wait before she stopped hoping the door would ever open again. The next morning he rode to the widow Agnes's place. She answered the door with flour dusting the sleeves of her apron. "Well now, Elias Thorne, this is a rare sight." "I need a pair of boots." "For a child?" Her expression sharpened. "Taking in a stray?" "No." "Then what's the trouble to you?" He didn't answer. She scrutinized him for a long, assessing moment before saying, "Their feet are no bigger than a sparrow. The one limps a little, and they both have the scars of frost on their heels." Agnes didn't press him further, just sighed and vanished into the back of her house. When she returned, the boots she carried were not new, but they were sturdy and whole. She wrapped them in a sheet of newspaper and secured it with twine. Then she pressed a small jar of peppermint salve into his hand. "For the scarring," she muttered. "Don't think I'm the only one who's noticed." That night, he left the boots on the cabin steps. The girls were not there. The next morning, they were wearing them. He saw them from a distance, walking with their father to the church meeting, their heads bowed, hands clasped behind their backs. The boots were a size too large, but their steps were steady. Iris glanced in his direction, a single fleeting look, but it was enough. Elias did not acknowledge it. There was no need. The days crawled by. The snowpack deepened. He spoke of the matter to no one, but every few nights he would pass the cabin. Sometimes the girls were outside, sometimes not. But the biscuit he left on the porch railing was always gone by morning. One evening, he discovered a folded piece of paper tucked under a loose floorboard. The handwriting was a child's, stiff and labored. "Sir, we hope you are not a dream." The words stopped his breath. He read them again in the moonlight. The ink was smudged, but the message was starkly clear. That night he sat on his own doorstep, not because he was shut out, but because he needed to comprehend what it felt like to wait in the cold, knowing you should not knock. He endured it for an hour. The next time he passed the Blackwood cabin, he brought a heavy wool blanket. He didn't leave it on the porch. He waited in the shadows of the trees. The girls emerged later than usual, their eyes shadowed and red, their hands tucked into the sleeves of each other's gowns. He stepped out, placing himself between them and the ceaseless wind. "This cannot continue," he murmured. Iris looked up at him, and for the first time she spoke. "Will you tell someone?" Her voice was faint, fragile, not with desperation, but with a profound weariness. Elias looked toward the house, toward the door that shut children out into the cold and called the act righteous. He looked back at her. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because they will not hear it from a man like me." He knelt, wrapping the blanket around both of them. Cora's lips trembled, and Iris clutched the edges as if it were a shield. "Then what are you doing?" Iris whispered. Elias did not answer. He rose to his full height, his gaze fixed on the dark, unlit window above them. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward his horse. Behind him, for the first time, the girls did not remain on the step. They followed him with their eyes, moving to the very edge of the porch to watch him disappear, enveloped in a warmth whose name they did not know. They stood there, twin shadows huddled under a single blanket, silent and unmoving. Inside, the door remained shut, but beneath it a sliver of cold air had begun to seep in, and somewhere in the bones of that house something ancient and cruel had started to give way. The snow had begun its slow retreat, melting into muddy ruts of sorrow by the time Elias Thorne saw them again, not as silhouettes against a door, but their faces, their true faces in the pale light of day. Iris possessed the intense stare of a hawk, a sharpness that was only slightly softened by exhaustion. Cora, the smaller of the two, blinked frequently, as if the world were a constant assault of dust and harsh light. They were sitting together behind the church, in a patch of gravel where no one ever looked. They were not playing or talking, just existing. Elias hadn't intended to find them. He was merely passing through town, taking a worn bridle to the blacksmith, his own thoughts as weary as his horse. But there they were, their backs against the cold stone of the foundation, knees drawn to their chests, hands clasped as if to keep them from trembling. He slowed his mare. Across the yard his eyes met Iris. Cora flinched and shrank behind her sister, a small bird startled by a distant clap of thunder. No one else seemed to notice them, or perhaps they chose not to. He gave a barely perceptible tip of his hat. Then he turned and rode on, hating the hollow space their image left in his chest. At the smithy, the forge roared with a heat that felt excessive. Sparks flew into the wind like angry epithets, yet he could still feel the profound quiet of that patch of gravel, of two children sitting like stunted trees, all roots and no blossoms. "Your thoughts are loud today, Thorn," the blacksmith grunted, not looking up from his anvil. Elias didn't respond. He paid for his repair and left. He rode past the town inn, where steam clouded the windows and the sound of laughter drifted out like the warm scent of rising bread. Leah was there, as she always was. She worked tirelessly without a word of complaint, her apron perpetually clean despite her chapped hands. She had kind eyes, the sort that saw the bruises that were never spoken of. She stepped outside to toss a bucket of dishwater into the slushy street and saw him. Her face broke into a reserved half-smile, the kind that asked for nothing. Elias reined in. "Have you seen the Blackwood girls?" he asked without preamble. Leah's face vanished, not with surprise but with a weary understanding. "They come in sometimes, when Silas allows it. They always sit at the back table, quiet as sewing needles." He nodded. "Do you feed them?"
She folded her arms across her chest. "Not without payment. Not unless a customer orders more than he can finish." A knowing silence stretched between them. "I could get clumsy," she said after a moment. "Might forget how much batter to mix." He held her gaze, an unreadable emotion flickering in his eyes. "Don't get caught." "Neither should you." He didn't ask what she meant. He already knew. Back at his ranch, the wind had changed. Meltwater trickled from the eaves, turning the ground to mud where snow had held dominion for months. Elias moved through his chores with a haunted efficiency, resetting fence posts, clearing troughs, and stacking firewood he didn't yet need. Then, in the barn, he found it. 2 charcoal drawings on the inner wall, at the height a small child could reach. One was a misshapen house. The other was a tall man in a hat. He stared at them for a long time. There were no footprints in the dirt, no evidence of their presence. But a section of hay in a back stall had been disturbed, as if someone had recently taken shelter there. He felt no anger, no sense of trespass. He simply sat down on a hay bale, rested his elbows on his knees, and studied the drawings as if they were a cipher only the pure of heart could decode. That night, he left a canteen of fresh water and a soft wool blanket folded neatly on his workbench in the barn. He slept poorly. In town, the judgment arrived more slowly than the thaw, but struck with a greater chill. At the mercantile, the widow Agnes spoke with the quiet, deliberate precision of a woman threading a needle. "Elias Thorne's been conversing with ghosts," she said to a rapt audience, "and they ain't his kin." "Pious children are meant to be quiet in severe households," added old Mr. Gable. "Means the father's either doing his duty or breaking their spirits in two," Leah muttered from behind a stack of canned goods, then bit her tongue. Elias ignored them. He paid for 2 jars of preserves and a bolt of fabric the color of sun-bleached clover. No one dared ask why a man who lived alone would require something so soft. As he was leaving, Agnes called out, "Ever wonder why your house is so empty, Thorne?" He paused in the doorway, turning just enough to meet her gaze. "Ever wonder why you keep speaking to things that have already walked away from you?" She blinked, and for the first time was left without a retort. The following week the girls vanished from sight. The cabin remained shut, though a steady plume of smoke rose from its chimney. Silas was seen in town hauling firewood and quoting scripture with the fervor of a man born to it. Elias rode past the cabin twice without stopping. The third time he did. He knocked, not loudly, more a warning than a request. There was no answer. He stepped back, his heart hammering as if he was the one committing a crime. Then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic thud from around the back. He circled the cabin cautiously. Behind it, down a slight incline and half hidden by overgrown brush, was an old storm cellar. The wooden door was ajar. He crouched, his hands steady. The air inside was dark and thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. He couldn't see anything clearly, but he could hear the faint sound of breathing. Iris. Cora. No sound. Then a whisper. Don't. He froze. We're not allowed, she said. He says if we leave, God will lose us. Elias didn't argue. He scanned the small space. Nothing but broken crates, damp ground, and a threadbare blanket that offered no real protection. Are you cold? Yes. He reached into his coat and pulled out his scarf. I'm not here to take you, just to give you this. He heard a rustle, then a small shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness. A hand emerged. Cora took the scarf. Will you tell? She whispered. No. Why not? He let out a slow breath. Because no one listens to me either. He stood. If you need food, it's in the barn. Same place. He walked back up the slope without looking back.
A house with smoke rising from the chimney, and a man, still tall, but this time he was holding two small hands. The first snowdrop bloomed near the creek bank that day. Something had shifted. But not everyone was pleased. Dr. Miller paid a visit to his ranch that afternoon, his boots caked in mud, his coat too fine for the dusty yard. You can't continue this, Elias. Didn't realize I was doing anything. You're feeding them, sheltering them. I'm not keeping them. The doctor folded his arms. You know what the law says? Elias stared at him, his jaw tight. I know what right says. You'll make enemies. I've had worse. Miller sighed. Silas is a twisted man, no doubt, but he's clever. He will twist this back on you. Elias didn't flinch, then let him. That night a storm rolled in, slow and menacing. The girls did not come. The barn remained empty. The food was untouched. He lit the lamp anyway, left the blanket out, and sat on his porch, staring into the oppressive dark until the sky finally broke open. By morning the wind had ceased. Mud spread across the trail like spilled ink. Nailed to his front door was the scarf he had given them. There was a dark stain of blood on the corner. His blood ran cold. He didn't hesitate. By noon, he reached the cabin. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, all was chaos. Furniture was overturned. A chair lay in pieces. The stove was cold. There were no children. Then he heard it, a weak rhythmic tapping, low to the ground, like something fighting to survive. He followed the sound to the back of the house. There, huddled in the mud, was Cora holding Iris in her arms. Iris's face was swollen and bruised, her lips split open. Cora's dress was soaked through. They weren't crying. They just looked at him with the hollow eyes of creatures that had seen too much. Is she breathing? He asked, his voice thick. Cora nodded. He knelt beside them and gently scooped Iris into his arms. She whimpered but did not resist. Cora clung to his leg. He didn't say a word. He just carried them back to his horse, back to the trail. The door of the storm cellar creaked in the wind behind him. As they rode away, Cora turned back once, watching the house disappear behind the bare, unforgiving trees. They did not look back again. Elias Thorne did not possess much, but what he had was clean, quiet, and built with his own two hands. The cabin contained a single bed he never shared, a stove that provided a slow, constant heat, and windows placed to capture the morning sun, as if someone had once valued the light. He had never expected to bring another soul into it, not since the fever had taken his wife. But now Iris lay curled beneath his quilt, her bruised lips trembling in her sleep, and Cora sat in a chair beside her, tracing circles on her sister's palm, a silent, wordless prayer. He made no grand promises, just a pot of thin soup. Cora watched his every action, not with suspicion or fear, but with a profound uncertainty, like an animal born in captivity, trying to distinguish which footsteps signaled comfort and which portended pain. When he offered her a bowl, she did not immediately eat. She held the spoon upright, as if expecting it to be snatched away. Iris did not speak for 2 days. When she finally did, it was a mere whisper to her sister. Elias did not pry. He fed them, washed their mud-caked clothes in the creek, and hung them near the stove to dry, like offerings to the hearth. Whenever he returned from the barn, he would knock on his own door, never entering until one of them bid him to. On the 3rd morning, he found Cora meticulously rearranging the logs in his woodpile according to size. Iris sat on the porch step with a piece of slate and a nub of chalk, drawing concentric circles. "You draw?" he asked softly. She gave a single nod. He crouched beside her, observing the pattern. "It looks like a wheel." Iris shrugged. "It's a clock, but it's broken." Elias had no reply. What could one possibly say to that? Later that evening, Leah arrived with fresh bandages, salve, and a loaf of warm bread. She didn't ask if the girls were there. She saw the 2 small pairs of shoes by the door and simply nodded. She placed the bread on the counter and the salve on the windowsill. Then she regarded him for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "You are a good man, but this town does not reward goodness, Elias." He offered her coffee. She accepted, staying for half a cup, her eyes repeatedly flicking toward the closed bedroom door where the girls were resting. "They won't remain a secret forever," she murmured. "I'm not asking them to." She looked at him then, her eyes full of a sorrow that was painful to witness. "You are going to lose something in all this, you know." He didn't answer because he knew she was right. The first stone landed on his porch 3 days later. It was wrapped in a torn page from the Bible. "Suffer the little children." He didn't mention it to the girls, just tossed it into the fire and watched the paper curl into ash. The second attack was a whisper campaign in town. The widow Agnes, her lips pursed in righteousness, spoke to anyone who would listen. "He is not their kin. A grown man living alone with 2 young girls. There is a name for such a thing." No one spoke the word aloud, but the silence around him grew heavy and thick, like smoke. Doors that had once been open to him now remained shut. People turned their backs more quickly, and when he rode past the church, Silas Blackwood stood on the steps, his arms crossed over his chest, looking like a devil dressed in a preacher's collar. "You have stolen what is mine," Silas called out. "I took nothing," Elias replied, not breaking stride. "They are my blood." Elias didn't bother to argue. There was no sense in reasoning with a man who had buried his own humanity and called the grave Scripture. The sheriff came next. Sheriff Brody was an older, slow-moving man worn down by decades of maintaining a fragile peace through compromise. He rode out one gray morning, his coat buttoned to his chin, a folded document in his breast pocket. "You know why I'm here," Brody said, not bothering to dismount. "I suppose Silas claims I abducted them." He does. He also claims they are prone to fantasy and rebellion. "They came to me bleeding." I'm not disputing that, but the law doesn't much care about the bleeding if the blood belongs to the man who claims ownership. Elias looked past him toward the barn where the girls were stacking small stones as if building a tiny sacred monument. "What do you want from me, Sheriff?" "I want you to be careful. I want you to understand that no matter what people believe in their hearts, they will almost always side with the devil they know over the stranger who tells the truth." Elias nodded once. "Have you ever seen a child forced to sleep outside in a frost?" Brody sighed, a sound of deep weariness. "You think I haven't?" He turned his horse and left, and the silence he left in his wake was more menacing than any threat. That night, Elias sat with the girls by the stove. He didn't speak, just handed them each a warm biscuit and let them decide if they wanted his company. Cora sat near him. Iris leaned back against the wall, watching the firelight flicker and dance across the floorboards. "I don't want to go back," Cora whispered. "You won't," Elias said. And for the first time, Iris looked him directly in the eye. "You can't stop him." "I can try." She shook her head, and in her small, hoarse voice, she said, "He doesn't break doors. He breaks people." Elias had no answer for that, only the weight of her words settling in the room like ash. The next morning, the sheriff posted a notice on the saloon door. Custody hearing to be held. Blackwood versus Thorne. Elias didn't drink, but he stood before it and read it twice. The townsfolk stared, none of them brave enough to meet his gaze. As he turned to leave, Agnes blocked his path. "Do you think you're some kind of hero?" she hissed. "I think I'm tired of watching children suffer." She looked him up and down as if he were something she had found on the bottom of her shoe. "You've always been alone for a reason, Elias. Now people are remembering why." He didn't reply. There was nothing to say. By evening, someone had painted a large red X on his fence. He scrubbed it off with lye. Iris watched him from the porch, her expression unreadable. "Why do they hate you?" she asked. "They don't, not really." "Then why do they do this?" "Because I remind them that they did nothing." Cora traced the edge of the window pane with her finger. "So we won't be staying long, will we?" Elias turned to her, kneeling to look at her in the eye. "You will stay as long as you need to." She looked at him for a long moment, then rested her forehead against his shoulder and held perfectly still. That night, Iris drew again. A cabin with an open window, 2 small girls, and 1 tall man standing guard. The next morning, the sheriff returned, this time accompanied by Silas and 2 men from the county court, all stiff collars and stern judgment. The girls were in the barn, painting stones with river mud. They didn't see the men arrive. "Mr. Thorne," one of the officials said, unfolding a document, "we are here to escort the Finch girls back to their father's custody, pending the hearing. They are not ready." "Their readiness is not a requirement." Elias stood his ground, his voice calm but unyielding. "Then you will have to be the ones to tell them." The man blinked. "We do not require their consent." "Then you are cowards." The sheriff looked at the ground, a flicker of shame on his face. Silas pushed his way forward. "Girls," he bellowed, "present yourselves." Iris appeared in the barn doorway first, mud on her knees, her eyes as hard as flint. Cora followed a step behind, her movements hesitant. "Come to your father," one of the court men ordered. The girls did not move. Elias turned to them. "It is your choice." Silas took a menacing step forward, raising his hand. "You will obey." Cora whimpered. Iris stepped in front of her. "No." The word was small, but it landed with the force of a thunderclap. Silas froze. "I am not yours," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You left us outside. You made us beg the door to open." One of the court officials stepped forward. "You are 7 years old. You do not get to decide." "She does now," Elias said, "or you will have to carry her away kicking and screaming." No one moved. Then Leah stepped out from behind the barn. In her hands she held a small tattered notebook, one of Iris's, open to a page covered in a drawing made with a bruised purple crayon. It depicted 2 stick figures, one lying on the ground, the other standing over it with a raised fist. Leah said nothing, just handed the book to the sheriff. He took it, his face grim. "We will delay the hearing," he said quietly. The courtmen hesitated, then nodded and turned away. Silas stood frozen, his face a mask of fury. Elias stepped between him and the girls.
This is the last time you will call them yours." Silas's face contorted. Then, without a word, he spun around and stormed away. The wind shifted. The silence that followed was different. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of space being cleared, of a home being made. The sky turned a bruised, ominous black the day before the fire. It wasn't the kind of storm Elias was used to. There was no wind yet, no thunder, just a heavy, watchful stillness crouched on the horizon, pregnant with unspoken threats. Cora sat by the hearth, carefully pulling strands of hay from a tattered doll Leah had stitched for her from old fabric scraps. Iris stood at the window, observing how the clouds dragged long shadows across the hills, as if she could read a portent in their slow, inexorable march. Elias was outside, splitting logs, the rhythmic rise and fall of the axe a metronome for his own racing thoughts. But he could feel it coming, not just the storm, but a reckoning. The town had fallen silent around him for a week. The quiet was too perfect. No gossip, no judgmental glances, just a complete absence. It was the kind of quiet that meant plans were being made behind closed doors. When Leah brought fresh bandages and a basket of biscuits, she did not cross the threshold. She stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself. "Someone saw Silas walking the edge of your property last night," she murmured. Elias nodded once. "I know. Do you have a gun?" "I have a door." She stared at him, the weight of the world etched into his brow. "Doors don't stop fire, Elias." He looked down at the basket she held. "What would?" Leah hesitated, then whispered, "Other people, standing on your porch with you." The wind rose that night, and the branches of the old poplar scraped against the window pane like fingernails. The girls were restless. Cora eventually crawled into Iris's small cot, curling up tightly against her sister's side. Elias didn't even attempt to sleep. He sat by the stove, his boots still on, his eyes fixed on the flames, one hand resting on the stock of a rifle he hadn't touched in years. He was not a violent man. He had spent a lifetime trying not to be. But the firelight seemed to demand confession, and in its flickering glow, he admitted a truth to himself he would never speak aloud. He would kill for them, not from a desire for violence, but because no one else ever had. Sometime after midnight, the smell in the air changed. It wasn't the familiar scent of wood smoke from his stove. This was sharper, acrid, and wrong. The smell of wood burning too fast, fueled by pitch and fury. Then came the sound. Not a knock on his door, but a loud thud against the barn wall, followed by a peal of derisive laughter. Elias was out the door before a second thud could land. The seams of the barn were already outlined in a hungry orange light. Flames were clawing their way up the far wall, as if they had been starved for air. A wave of heat struck his face as he ran toward it, his boots sinking into the soft, thawing earth. He didn't waste breath shouting, just moved with a swift certainty, wrenching the wide doors open. The stalls were empty. The girls were safe. But everything else, his tools, the winter feed, the drawings on the walls, the old coat he had worn the winter his wife died, it was all being consumed. He grabbed the water barrels, knowing it was a futile gesture. He soaked a blanket, threw it over his shoulders, and charged into the inferno like a man trying to rescue his own heart. Inside, the flames roared, and the roof timbers groaned in agony. He dragged out what he could, a bridle, an axe, Leah's old sewing kit. But the heat was a physical presence, pressing in on him like the very breath of hell. When he finally staggered out, choking and drenched in sweat, the roof collapsed behind him with a deafening crash. He fell to his knees in the mud, one hand pressed to the ground, the other clutching a length of singed rope, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The girls ran to him, barefoot in their nightgowns, their eyes wide with terror. Cora clung to his arm. Iris stood perfectly still, ashes settling in her hair like a grim snowfall. Behind them, more footsteps approached. Neighbors, Sheriff Brody,
the widow Agnes wrapped in a shawl. They had not come to help, they had come to watch. Elias rose slowly, his face streaked with soot, his chest heaving. "Is this your justice?" he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "You let him burn it all down because I dared to care." Brody looked at his feet. Agnes swallowed hard. "He's telling people you set the fire yourself," the sheriff mumbled. "I didn't." A long silence followed. Then Iris stepped forward. "He did," she said, her voice small but carrying with absolute clarity. She turned to face the crowd. "We weren't sleeping. We were hiding." Cora nodded, tears finally streaming down her soot-stained face. "He wanted to burn us in our beds." The wind shifted, and the fire crackled behind them like a preacher clearing his throat. Agnes looked at the girls, then at Elias, and then, for the first time, she seemed to look at herself. "He is not the first man to hide his cruelty behind the word of God," she whispered. Elias looked up. Agnes turned to the others. "And we have all let it happen." No one spoke. Then Leah emerged from the shadows. She walked directly to the girls, knelt, and wrapped her own shawl around their trembling shoulders. "They stay here," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Brody nodded slowly. Elias did not weep, but something deep inside him that had been frozen for years finally cracked open. The barn smoldered into the morning. Iris found a piece of charcoal in the ruins and began to draw circles in the ashes. But this time, as she drew, she smiled, just a little. The days following the fire passed like smoke, slow, clinging, and difficult to breathe. The barn was a skeleton of blackened timbers, and its acrid smell permeated everything. Elias rose before dawn each day and worked with blistered hands, silently refusing all offers of help or pity. He rebuilt the fence, rail by painstaking rail, but he left the barn ruins untouched. It felt like a desecration to disturb the dead too soon. The girls were quiet in those first days, but it was a new kind of quiet, not the silence of fear, but the unfamiliar hush that precedes music. They stayed close, helping in small ways without being asked. Cora would bring him nails, one by one. Iris swept the ashes into neat piles. Then, breaking a broom handle in two, she fashioned a tiny cross and placed it over the spot where her drawings had once been. On the fourth morning, Elias found a folded piece of paper beside his coffee cup. In Cora's careful, deliberate printing, it read, "Is it all right if we call this our home now?" He didn't write a reply. He simply placed the note on the mantelpiece, using it as a taper to light the morning fire, not to destroy it, but to keep it warm. Sheriff Brody came that afternoon, his horse moving at its usual unhurried pace, his hat in his hands. "He's filed again," Brody said, sighing as if the words themselves cost him something. "Silas has taken it to the judge, a formal custody hearing. The circuit judge will be here in 2 days from Dry Bend." Elias didn't flinch. "Has he tried anything else?" "No, he's been laying low, but he will show up to court looking like a saint, and you know the law favors a blood claim." "He's not their blood." Brody looked away. "He doesn't have to be good, Elias. He just has to look better than you." That night sleep was a stranger to the small cabin. Cora paced the floorboards. Iris climbed into Elias's armchair and curled into a tight ball, as if bracing for a physical blow. Elias sat across from her, his boots off, a cup of cold coffee in his hands. "I don't want to go back," she whispered to the floor. "You won't." "You can't promise that." "I can." "You would lie?" He didn't answer immediately, just held her gaze until she was the first to look away. In town, the judge arrived with immaculate cuffs and a schedule as tight as a noose. The hearing would be swift, he announced. The circumstances were unfortunate, but not, in his experience, exceptional.
Silas presented himself impeccably. His hands were clean, his collar starched, a Bible tucked under his arm as if it were a natural extension of his body. He spoke of reformation, of regret, of a renewed devotion. He blamed Elias's interference for the fire, claiming the girls had been led into a state of rebellion. He spoke of their mother's passing as a spiritual trial, not a descent into neglect and cruelty. Elias spoke plainly. He did not plead or raise his voice. He simply told the truth. Of the nights on the porch, of the drawings in the barn, of the silence of children who had been trained not to cry. But the judge was a weary man, and weary men tend to favor the familiar, no matter how monstrous. At dusk, as the courthouse lamps cast a sallow glow behind drawn blinds, Elias stood on the steps outside with the girls. They sat on either side of him, their knees drawn up, their faces pale. "He's going to take us," Cora said. It wasn't a question or a plea, but a statement of fact. Iris took her hand. "We'll run away." "He'll find us. Then we'll hide." The courthouse door opened. Silas stepped out, a grin on his face sharp enough to cut glass. The judge followed, looking grimly satisfied. And then Leah appeared, stepping directly between them all. "I need to speak," she said. "You are not on the docket, madam." "I am now," she replied, her voice quiet but fierce. "You saw the drawings, you saw the burns on this man's hands, you saw the scars on these children. What more proof do you require? A corpse?" Silas started toward her. "This is not your concern, woman." "It became my concern the first time I saw one of them flinch when a man raised his voice." The judge looked back and forth between them. "This matter must be settled." Iris stood up. Then Cora. And then slowly, one by one, the townsfolk began to emerge from the shadows. The widow Agnes, Dr. Miller, even the blacksmith. They didn't hold signs or shout. They simply lined the edges of the town square, their presence a silent testimony. Sheriff Brody stepped forward and handed the judge a folded letter. Silas Blackwood was seen purchasing lamp oil and a bundle of rags 2 nights before the fire. Paid in cash, no receipt requested. The storekeep is willing to testify. The judge's expression faltered. Silas opened his mouth, then closed it again. Iris walked forward and placed her chalk sketchbook on the judge's bench. The wind caught the pages, flipping through images of fire, of raised fists, of barred windows, of haunted faces. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The judge cleared his throat. "Custody will remain with Mr. Elias Thorne, pending a full review in 6 months." Silas stormed away without another word. Elias watched him go, but felt no need to follow him. He had already won everything that mattered. Later that night, the girls helped him clear a patch of ground near the ashes of the barn. Cora held the lantern high. Iris knelt, smoothing the dark soil with her hands. "What are we going to plant here?" she asked. "Nothing yet," Elias said, looking from the overturned earth to the 2 small faces illuminated in the lantern light. "But the ground is ready." Iris looked up at him. He added, "Just like you." She smiled. It was a small thing, but the wind caught it and carried it across the porch like a blessing.